Let's see here. Johnson, right? All right. 2.5. Davis, you got a little extra credit for wearing WVSU gear today.
Appreciate that.
Got less than a minute. All right, it's 8. As always, I get started slowly, hoping people will show up. I mentioned earlier, for those of you who are here extra early, everybody who's here today gets a little bit extra credit just for being here on a Friday. It won't be like that every Friday, but as predicted, we have a lot fewer people than we do usually through the week because it's Friday and I'm kind of loose on my attendance. So extra credit for all of you for being here for that. And then obviously, if you're wearing WVSU gear, you got a little extra credit for that. And those of you who were here more than 5 minutes early got extra credit for that too. So a lot of extra credit given out today. When's the first football game? It is tomorrow? All right. I'm going to try to write this down if I can remember it and share it with you. But if you go to the game, and I guess I'm trying to think if it's fair. Let me think about what if you have to be there, like if you're in the band or you're a football player or you're a cheerleader, whatever.
It's away.
It's away? Ooh, even more. All right. I'll write it down. Let me think about what to do. Usually I give people a little bit of like maybe 1 point of independent work for going to school events if you don't have to be there, but let me think it over. All right, let's talk about announcements. Usually when we have an exam, when we're about a week away like we are now, we'll start talking about it and I'll start getting your input and I'll say, when do you want to take the exam? But next week's kind of special because it's independent. It is Labor Day, so we only have 2 days of class next week, so there's not much wiggle room. So what we're going to do is pull this up here. There we go. Yeah, there we go. So the exam for next week, it's set in stone pretty much. Moving forward, I'll work with you and we'll figure things out. So you two are on time. Just make sure you let me know before you leave to put you down for attendance. Anyway, we don't have class on Monday because it's Labor Day. So we won't be in person, we won't be online, nothing. Wednesday, we're going to have an exam review. Now, first, let me say this. This is the last time we're going to do this. It's the first and last time. This is the only time where I'm going to devote an entire lecture to an exam review. From now on, after this one, moving forward, I'm still going to do this, but I'm going to pick some other time that's not in the class time. I'm going to be online and say, if you want to come, you can. And if you don't want to, you don't have to. So this is the only one that's mandatory and the only one that I'm going to devote an entire class period to. And for those of you, like let's say, next time I do it Tuesday at 3 p.m. and you can't make it for whatever reason. You have 2 options. I'm going to record it so you can watch the video. Or 2, you can say, hey, I couldn't make it. That's not fair. Then I'll meet with you individually if I need to and if you want to. Does that make sense? All right. So speaking of the one on Wednesday, like I said, it's going to be online. So if you don't know how to go online, go to Google Classroom. There's a video that shows you how to meet online. And if that doesn't work, meet me and I'll show you how to do it. Actually, let me pull this up very quickly. I just want to show you. It's important to know this because we're not meeting physically here on Wednesday for the exam review. It's all going to be online. So you have to meet me online. Attendance will be me calling you names just like I do now, but you'll be online to say, I'm here. Let's see. Here we are. So when you come up here, whether you're in stream or classwork, you'll see at the top, it says meet link. That's all you have to do is click that. And that's the link that brings you to the online meeting. You've heard of Zoom meetings and things like that. Same thing, except it's Google instead of Zoom. So again, it's right there. Or if you hit classwork, it is right there. Any questions on that? So that's how we're meeting on Wednesday for the exam review. Make sure you know that. And again, for this time, attendance is mandatory, just like it would be for any other class, so you have to be there. So what are we going to cover during the exam review? We are going to cover, obviously, the exam. Sorry, I'm fighting with, there we go. Study guides. So I want to remind you what I said earlier in the semester. Your exams, other than the few questions that are going to come from the syllabus, are going to be directly from all those questions on the study guides I've given you. So I'm going to take those questions, 50, so about a third, and a third, because there's 3 chapters. 50 of the questions are going to come from about 50 of those questions are going to come from the study guide. I'm going to take those questions and I'm going to reword them. So make sure you study the study guide and not verbatim. Don't like memorize like, okay, I remember exactly what this question asks and exactly what the answer is, because that's not going to help you. Understand the concept of the questions, because again, I will reword the questions. And as we do the exam review, for some of them, I'll give you some examples. I'm like, all right, here's the answer to this question, but here's how I might reword this question. So before we have the exam review on Wednesday, I highly recommend doing the study guides. Write down the ones that you have problems with. That way, when you come in, you can say, okay, what I'm going to do is I say, all right, which ones do you guys need help with? And then you'll say, all right, chapter 2, question 58, whatever. And I'll go there and I'll answer. Or if no one has questions, which sadly is usually the case, I'll just start at the beginning and work my way down. Chapter 1, question 2. And I'll just do that. But we only have 50 minutes, so eventually I'll run out of time and we probably won't cover everything. So again, I highly recommend doing the study guides and writing down the ones that you need help with. So any questions on the exam review? All right, the exam's on Friday. You have options. Wait, hold on, let me back up. On Wednesday, even though we have the exam review online and we're not meeting in person for the exam review, we will have in-person labs. So labs just like normal. Just be here at noon for lab. Good? Okay. Moving forward for the exam, you have options. The exam will be turned in online, just like the study guides. This is another reason why I want you to do the study guides, because as far as the layout and how it works, it's exactly the same. You log in, there's multiple choice questions. So that part's exactly the same. If you do the study guides, you're used to the format, that's good. So anyway, you can either turn it in that way, or sometime between now and then, you need to formally request a written version. So, like send me an email so I have a paper trail and a reminder. And then come in on Friday and I will give you your written paper exam. So if you're doing it online, where you're turning it in online, your two options are come in and bring your computer and just do it there, or be wherever you want. You don't have to come in if you don't want. So if you choose the online option, like really online, where you don't even come in, sort of like the exam review. You're gonna log onto that Google Meets so I can see your face. So I have your camera on because I got to make sure you're not like sitting right next to your buddy doing the exam together or flipping through your book, right? Any questions? So those are your two options. 3 if you look at it that way. Either come in and do it in person, or meet online with Google Meets. Good? What else? And again, if you want a paper version, that's okay. Oh yeah, and finally, you only have 50 minutes to take the exam. 50 minutes to take about 50 questions. If you need more time, that is completely okay with me. Just email me, we'll work something out. Like what we'll do if you need more time is we'll meet one-on-one. Whether it's in person or online, we'll pick a time where I can meet you. And again, it'll be one-on-one. So if it's online, you'll have your computer on with your camera on and I can see you and I can know that you're not cheating. As long as I know you're not taking an open book test, I'll give you pretty much as much time as you want. But you have to let me know, like this weekend. You can't tell me on Thursday, hey, I need more time for that exam tomorrow. So you can't tell me last minute. We're good? Let me know now. I will definitely work with you. I hate timed exams, but again, I also hate people cheating. So it is what it is. Yeah, so that's it for that. Another reason, that's also why we're having the exam review online on Wednesday. That way you can work out the kinks and see what it's like to be online. What else? Oh yeah, one more thing about the exam. On Friday, when I post the exam, you'll have to keep an eye on your email because that's how it's going to work, unless you have a paper version. You'll get an email. It should pop up at 8 a.m. I'm actually going to have it set to be a little bit earlier just in case it takes longer. But anyway, you should get the email at 8. You open it up, you take the exam, and then you have to close your exam by 8:50. There's no reminder. Nothing's going to come up and say, all right, your time's up, or it won't automatically close. You have to close it at 8:50. Otherwise, you lose points. Every minute that you're late, you lose a point. Good? All right. And again, I'll say all that stuff again when we do the exam review. On Friday, we talked about having a hike this weekend. That's fallen through. My people that were coming into town are quarantined for COVID, so it's not happening. Anyway, any questions on announcements? Any other questions at all? All right, let's move forward. Hopefully we can finish chapter 3 today. Ooh, if we can't finish chapter 3 today, then Wednesday we'll still meet online, but we'll finish chapter 3 before we jump into the study, the review. That being said, let's move forward. Hopefully kind of quickly. So we're done talking. All right. Remember, first bullet point was all the background information you need to study the second bullet point. You know what polymers are. You know what monomers are. You know how carbon works, all that stuff. You know, dehydration reaction brings things together. Hydrolysis reaction breaks things. Then we started getting into the meat and potatoes of this chapter, which is talking about carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. We're done with carbs. For carbs, you needed to know that the polymer is a polysaccharide. The monomer is a monosaccharide. You needed to know the three different types of carbs in general: monosaccharide, disaccharide, polysaccharide. You needed to know for the polysaccharides that there's starch, which is energy for plants, glycogen, which is energy for animals, and cellulose, which is energy for, structure for plants. And of course, there's other carbohydrates out there in the world, or polysaccharides, but those are the ones we concern ourselves with in this course. And that finally brings us to lipids. Ooh. And if you remember, before we started talking about carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, we said that there are three categories of macromolecules, which are these things that are made up of monomers, right? The polymers made up of monomers. And when we talked about that, we said that there was carbs, proteins, and nucleic acids. And back then I said, but then there's this other fourth category, which falls under the category of biological molecules, but it's not technically a macromolecule because it's not a polymer made up of identical monomers. Not that I'm going to test you on that, and I just want you to keep that in the back of your mind as we go forward. So with the other three, you need to know the monomer and the polymer. Lipids are a little bit different. They are made up of different things, but it's not necessarily a monomer. So let's jump into it. Here we have a picture of oil and vinegar. For the sake of this discussion, since it's sort of a chemical discussion, we can basically consider that vinegar water. So what's happening? Or is this oil and vinegar mixed, or what's going on? It's not mixed, right? It's separated because oil and vinegar or oil and water don't mix. You guys know that, right? What happens if you shake it? What is it? Does anybody know what happens if you shake like salad dressing that was separated, but then you shake it? What happens? Bubbles up, right? That's better. That's a better term than saying it mixes because it doesn't technically mix. That's called emulsification, not that you need to know that. But when you shake it, it looks like it's all one liquid, right? But it's not. Technically what's happening is little tiny bubbles of vinegar in the oil, or maybe oil in the vinegar. So it's still separated. It just looks like it's together because you physically mixed it. But anyway, oil and vinegar don't mix. That's something you need to know. Specifically, this is what you need to know. Looking backwards, so far everything we've talked about, which is carbs, those are hydrophilic. You need to know what hydrophilic means. Hydro meaning water, philic, which basically means love or attracted to. So anything that is hydrophilic loves water. It's attracted to water. It dissolves in water. So that's why sugar dissolves in water. It's hydrophilic. Salt, which is not a carb, but it is hydrophilic, right? Because it dissolves in water. The opposite of that would be lipids. Lipids are hydrophobic. They don't mix in water. They're not attracted to water. And if you remember, when we talked about functional groups, I showed you that chart and said you didn't need to remember it, but if you happen to remember it, they give you the little column all the way on the right, gave you some of the properties of each one of those functional groups. And one of them would be like, is it hydrophobic or is it hydrophilic? So hydrophobic things and hydrophilic things don't mix. And that'll be a little bit actually more important for the next section when we start talking about proteins. But right now, it's just a good introduction. So again, you need to know what hydrophilic means. You need to know what hydrophobic means. You need to know that fats are hydrophobic. You need to know that carbs are hydrophilic. And the other two that we talk about, we don't necessarily categorize them as either because they're so unique. Parts of them are hydrophilic and parts of them are hydrophobic. So that's what you need to know for the exam. Any questions? All right. Like I mentioned earlier, lipids, they're a little bit different than carbs and proteins and nucleic acids. Because like I said, they're not technically these huge macromolecules. And they're also not technically polymers made up from monomers. So, you know, I used a train as an example for a polymer, and each train car was a monomer, which makes sense because here you have a train. All the monomers are the same. I mean, they're all might be a little bit different, but the monomer is the train car, right? And so for carbohydrates, the monomer is the monosaccharide. Here, yes, it's made up of different parts, but it's not all the same parts. That's why it's not considered a polymer made up of monomers. I won't test you on this. Just keep this in the back of your mind that this is what we're talking about now is slightly different than everything else we're talking about. So what your book says lipids are, they are a diverse group of molecules that are made from different molecular building blocks. There's nothing to write down on this slide. None of this will be on the exam. It's just an introduction before we get into it. So any questions about this? All right. So in this class, we're going to talk about two different types of lipids. So it might be hard to read that, but we have fats and steroids. There are other types of lipids, and you can look that up for independent work if you want. But these are the two we're going to talk about. So again, under the category of lipids, we have two things that we're going to talk about. Fats and steroids. That might be a test question. Moving forward. I think fats, well, we'll come back to that. A typical fat is actually called a triglyceride. So if you're taking notes, you could put shorthand fat equals triglyceride. Or maybe fat in parentheses. Or not, yeah. Anyway, fat equals triglyceride. So when I use the word triglyceride in this course, I'm talking about a typical fat. Like I said, it's still made up of smaller parts, technically not a polymer made up of monomers, but here are the parts. And you need to know the parts. The typical triglyceride is a glycerol, that's where it gets the glyceride part of the name, joined with 3 fatty acid molecules. So it's a glycerol and 3 fatty acids. Glycerol, that's in the glyceride part, and the 3 fatty acid part, that's where the tri comes in. So it's in the name. Now, I won't try to be tricky. If anything, if I ask you what it's made of, because it's a multiple choice exam, probably the only part that's going to vary is the number of fatty acids, I think. Basically, just study the question on the study guide. Yeah, so as far as the taking notes is concerned, that's probably the most important part of this slide. These 2 parts right here. Whoop, where are we at? No, those. That out of the way. Yes, fatty acids, which are the long parts that stick to the glycerol, those are long. They're energy rich. You can think back when I showed you that picture of a hamburger and a can of gasoline, and we talked about the structure and function. I said, look, there's octane, and there's, I think it was some kind of fat. I don't remember what it was. Doesn't matter. Point is, they're long. They have a lot of energy. How much energy? Specifically, they have twice the energy of a carb. So when you think of fat, if you were not in this class and I said, I'm feeling really fat, what do you think I mean by that? Like, how would you describe that? I think, and I am, right? I've got some jiggly on me. And I think that's what most people think of when they think of fat, unless you're talking about food. But other than that, you're probably thinking of this, and that's that third bullet point. This triglycerides, they're stored in adipose cells. So when someone says they're fat, like my beer gut, that's adipose cells, right? Those fat cells are called adipose cells. And again, none of that will really be on the exam. The most important part is these 2 up here. The typical fat is called a triglyceride. The triglyceride is made up of glycerol molecules joined with 3 fatty acid molecules. Any questions about that? On this next slide, I'm going to show you what a glycerol molecule looks like and what 3 fatty acid molecules look like. That's the glycerol. Well, let me skip this because if you download the PowerPoint, this is an animation. It'll show you this attaching to this attaching to this attaching to this. So right now, that's not a triglyceride. Right now, that's 4 separate parts. But it comes together to make a triglyceride. Since it's coming together, what kind of reaction is that? Now, I get it if you haven't memorized it yet, but you do need to know it before the exam. When we build molecules as opposed to break them down, what kind of, I almost said it. What kind of reaction is it? I'll give you a hint. It squeezes water out, so to speak. Good, dehydration. You can see here, this is a picture of what the video shows. This fatty acid is attaching to that glycerol. So there we go. There's a hydrogen there, there's an OH there, and that makes the water. So anyway, again, not that you need to specifically know that for fatty acids, but in general, remember, if you bring things together in this class, that is a dehydration reaction. So anyway, here is a full triglyceride. I will point this out too. The glyceride part, or the glycerol, that is always that exact form. Now the fatty acids, those things differ. You see, this one's straight, this one's curved, right? this one's longer than this one. You guys can see all that, right? And that'll be important a little bit farther in a few slides. But the point is, they're not all the same. They are different. And because they are different, because they have slightly different structures, they also have slightly different functions. Any questions about that? What do you think we need fat for? Humans, not just life in general, but in humans, why do we need fat? There's three main purposes that your book gives. So think about the fat on or in your body, however you want to look at it. What do you need it for? All right, so like, say for example, if you're fat because you eat too much or drink too much, like me, extra calories get stored in fat, right? And what's the purpose of that? What is it? Energy, yeah, energy, right? So it's stored energy. Because remember, we said it's twice the energy as carbs. So really, it's twice when you store energy as fat as opposed to glycogen. That's a lot of energy. I've got a lot of energy ready to go. So what's the other one? We got energy. We got two more. Insulation, good. That one's a little bit less intuitive, right? Because most humans these days, we have heat, we've got clothes, we have access to fire, we can control it. So for us, that's not that important. But for other animals like polar bears, for example, very important. What's another one? Good, cushioning, right? And that's easy to remember because you're sitting down on two relatively gigantic cushions, right? You've got fat on your rear end, and that's why it's cushioning. So yeah, there you go. And also at the bottom of your feet. You're fat-footed. But yeah, energy storage, cushioning, and insulation. Maybe you know that for the exam. I don't know if I'm going to ask you or not, but it's pretty simple. Pretty intuitive too, I think. Other than the whole insulation thing, that might be a little bit harder to remember. If you want to remember that easier, just study this like at midnight outside when it's 50 degrees outside, wearing a bathing suit. And like, oh yeah, insulation. Any questions about that? All right, let's go back to this idea that the glycerol molecule is identical. It's always the same. But remember, like I said, the fatty acids themselves differ. And that's important. First of all, you need to know the difference between saturated and unsaturated. What are we saying saturated? Usually when someone says saturated, they mean water, right? Like, oh, my shirt is saturated. That usually means like, maybe you've been in the rain and it's completely soaked. Or you've been sweating and it's completely soaked in sweat. But really, when we say saturated, what we mean is like it's taken in as much as it could. So again, if your shirt is saturated because of the rain, what we mean is it's saturated with water. If it's saturated with sweat, what we mean is like it's completely soaked. You can't add any more to it. In this situation, what we mean is hydrogens. So you can see up here, this saturated fatty acid has all the hydrogens it can fit, right? Every single one of those carbons has a single bond either to another carbon or to a hydrogen. So we could not squeeze any more hydrogens onto that thing. On the other hand, if there's not as many hydrogen atoms as you could squeeze on there, that is called unsaturated. You don't have to know this, but it might help you remember. The way that comes about is if you ever have a double bond in between the carbons. So there, instead of this carbon being bonded to a hydrogen, instead of that carbon being bonded to a hydrogen, what you have instead is they're double bonded to each other. So that's two hydrogens you missed out on. And that might seem trivial, but it's not. Actually, let me come back to this. So far you understand the difference between saturated and unsaturated, correct? It's all about the hydrogens, and that will almost definitely be a test question. What is it saturated with? Hydrogens, yes.
That other chart you showed before this one with the 3 lines on it,
that
bottom one was unsaturated, the one that went like this and dropped down.
Yep. That's another thing, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, but anytime you see one that has a kink in it that's not straight, that means it's unsaturated. If it's saturated, it has no double bonds, it's all single bonds, so it's going to be straight. If it's unsaturated, that's going to give it a kink. So as long as you understand that concept, we'll move to the next one, which is that to be saturated, like if you say, all right, that's a saturated fat, that means all three, because remember it's a triglyceride, all three have to be saturated for it to be considered a saturated fat. So even if just one of the three is unsaturated, it is then considered an unsaturated fat. Another thing to point out before we move forward, there's also something called polyunsaturated, which I'm not going to ask you about on the exam, but keep in mind, just for you to know. So here we have this one kink, right? This one double bond. Polyunsaturated would have more than one of those double bonds. So not only would it kink once, it would kink more than once. And that'll be important here in a second. Another thing to note that's not on this and may not even be in your book. Like I said earlier, some of them are really short, some of them are really long. Some of them have one kink, some of them had many kinks. You could be one, like this one, that only has one kink, but maybe it was here instead of here. Maybe it was here instead of here. Does that make sense? So this is just an example. It's not like all unsaturated fats have that one kink right there, and then they're that one length. They're all very different. And that's very important because, well, first of all, let me ask you this. Imagine if those were like, we physically had those, not actual carbons, but maybe blocks. We had a block attached to a block, like a straight line of blocks, and they were all attached to smaller blocks just like that. And then we had this thing made of blocks, but it's kind of got a curve in it. And I asked you to stack these as high as you could. Which one do you think would be easier to stack, the saturated or the unsaturated? Like you literally just wanted to stack them on top of each other. If they were made out of blocks, like forget chemistry, just their physical shape, which one would be easier to stack? Saturated, right? Because it's just straight, right? Yeah, some might be longer than others, but for the most part, it's just straight. So they stack right on top of each other. Unsaturated, unless they were all that exact size and that exact kink, they're not going to stack on top of each other. And that is important because that is why saturated fats are bad for you. So you do need to know that saturated fats are generally bad for you. You do need to know that you should associate animal fats with saturated fats. So when you think of saturated fats, you should think animals and you should think unhealthy. And again, the reason, now we're going back to chemistry, the fact that they can stack so easily, that means they can, you know, they're close, they can fit closely together, and they're solid at room temperature. And solid is not good because if it's in your arteries, then it clogs it, right? That's not good because you need blood to flow. So that's how it happens. And again, unsaturated fats, because they don't stack nicely on top of each other, they are not solid. So they, you know, it's healthier. Yeah, that's the most important thing that you need to know. Again, you should associate saturated fats with animals and being unhealthy. This whole idea of why it's unhealthy and the fact that it stacks and clogs your arteries, that's for your own knowledge. The most important thing for this exam is that you know saturated fats are unhealthy because they stack easily. Not necessarily the details of how, just in general that they stack easily. And you should associate that with animals. Any questions about that? All right. So let's move away from saturated fats and talk about unsaturated fats. Actually, that picture should have been somewhere else. This picture should have been on the other side. And that was from the beginning of the chapter. There you have a child eating chocolate. So when the chocolate was just sitting there in the container or in its wrapping, it was solid, right? You can see now that he's holding it, it's turning liquid, right? It's rubbing on his face, it's getting on his hands, and that's because it's a saturated fat. It's solid at room temperature, but you add a little bit of heat to it, and it liquefies. Anyway, moving away from saturated fats, let's talk about unsaturated fats. You should associate mostly plants and fish with unsaturated fats. That's the most important thing for the exam. For unsaturated fats, you should associate them with plants and fish fats. There are some exceptions. Tropical plants are the exception. I don't have time to get into it, but you don't need to know it, but if you want to, look into it for independent work. Why tropical plants? Why do they have so many saturated fats? It kind of makes sense. I'll give you a hint. Tropical plants grow in the tropics, obviously. Tropics are very hot. So that's just your hint, your springboard, if you will. So yeah, when you think of healthy fats and unsaturated fats, for the exam, you should think plants and fish fats. But for your own knowledge, you could think like peanut butter, olive oil, avocados, walnuts, you know, it's all stuff that's good for you. Here's a picture from your book. You definitely do not need to know this for the exam. It's just an example. But if I were to give you this picture on the exam, like here's corn oil, here's palm oil, here's butter. If I give you anything, I'll give you this information, and the question will simply say, of the three, which has the most saturated fats? And all you need to do is be able to look at this and say, oh yeah, the butter has the most saturated fats. Or I might say, of the three, which one has the least polyunsaturated? And then you can look and say, oh yeah, butter has the least polyunsaturated. Does that make sense? So if anything, you just need to interpret this very simple information. Whew. So what we can do, I'm going to go through this quickly because it's not on your exam. It's not important for the rest of the semester. What can be done is you can turn unsaturated fats into saturated fats, because remember, a saturated fat is saturated with hydrogens. An unsaturated fat isn't. So if you take an unsaturated fat and chemically add some hydrogens to it, that would make it saturated. That process is called hydrogenation. The reason we do that is because it keeps things from going bad quickly, sort of like a preservative. It's good for frying stuff, and I won't get into that. I don't have time. You can look up for independent work why that is. It's solid at room temperature. That's like margarine. You take oil, you make it look like butter. And it can create something called trans fat, which are very bad for your health. That won't be on the exam. This won't be on the exam either, but it's just something you should know for your own life. Omega-3 fatty acids are really, really healthy. They reduce heart disease, arthritis symptoms, irritable bowel syndrome, all kinds of stuff. More than that, I think that's all your book lists. You can look it up for independent work. Where do you find it? Mostly in oily fish and nuts. So fish like salmon, for example. So when you buy fish oil, at the grocery store or drugstore or whatever, and it's in a little pill form, that's what it's for. Any questions about that? Here's sort of a table / visualization of everything we said, and a good reminder for what you need to know for the exam. You should associate saturated fats with animal products and being unhealthy. Generally speaking, that is true. So you might not look at ice cream and think that's an animal product, but remember, ice cream is made of dairy. Anyway, yeah. So saturated fats, animal, unhealthy. Unsaturated fats, generally speaking, healthy and plant-based or fish-based. Any questions about that? Okay, we're halfway done with lipids, because remember, there's two different categories of lipids. There's fats, which we just discussed, and the next one is steroids. What do you think of when you think of steroids? So forget the class for a second. When someone says steroids, what are you thinking of? Needles? Okay, because yeah. Okay, what else? What is it?
People get real buff.
People get real buff, right? So basically, you two are talking about the same thing. Because I think, as far as everybody I know who's ever illegally taken steroids, that's how they did it, was through a syringe. Anybody else? Has anybody? You don't have to answer this because it's HIPAA, but I will answer this. I've taken steroids. You've taken steroids? If you want, you don't have to answer this. Do you remember why? That's a better question. I'll say, do you remember? Because if you don't remember.
Yeah. I had a really bad skin condition, and it helped a lot.
There you go.
It did make me bloat.
That,
It had a lot of side effects.
So he said he had a skin condition, and he took steroids for that. And that's good, and then we'll talk about that in a second. That makes sense. I took it because I had, I guess technically you could call it a skin condition, poison ivy. So I got prescribed like 7 that day and then 6 the next day because you've got to taper off of it. So anyway, yeah, steroids. I think most people think what they thought at first, or at least talked about, which is like people illegally using them to get built. So let's talk about them. First of all, keep that thought in the back of your mind. That's a very specific type of steroid, everything we've said. And we're going to come back to those. Right now, what I'm telling you is there's so much more to steroids than just that. What you do need to know about steroids is that obviously they fall under the category of fats, or lipids, excuse me. They're a carbon skeleton that has these 4 rings. So anytime you see anything like this in this class, there'll be different variations of it, but if it has these 4 rings, it is a steroid. I probably won't ask you that. And if I do, I'm not going to be tricky and show you something that has 4 rings that are close, but not exactly like that. Not at all. If I were to ever do anything where I showed you a picture of it, it would be exactly a picture of a steroid exactly, or it would be a picture of a triglyceride exactly, right? There will be no me trying to trick you. Anyway, so even though they all have this carbon skeleton, they all have slightly different functions. And because of that, or the reason they have that, is because they have slightly different functional groups. So for the exam, you should think steroids have this base carbon skeleton, and what really makes them different than each other is the functional groups. So any questions about that? So you're all familiar with steroids. Can anyone give me an example of a steroid? And I know there's one that you know. You might not know it's a steroid. Yeah.
Estrogen.
Estrogen is a good one. Yeah. What else?
This albuterol inhaler.
Yes.
Corticosteroid.
Yeah, my daughter takes one of those. It makes her the devil when she takes it. She takes something else, but when she takes that, when the doctor's like, all right, you take that, it changes her. She gets roid rage, I guess, when you think about it. Anyway, so yeah, like he said, estrogen, albuterol. We won't talk about albuterol in this class, but there's a big one that you all have heard of, cholesterol, and we'll come back to that one too. You do need to know cholesterol is a steroid, because as far as we're concerned in this class, it's the most important steroid, because basically it's the base steroid. As far as we're concerned, every other steroid came from cholesterol. We took cholesterol, you know, that basic look, there's that basic 4-ring structure, right? We took it, we make some adjustments to the functional groups, and boom, now we have other steroids. For example, like he said, estrogen on the right, testosterone on the left. Obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, I don't know what you guys know. Estrogen is that hormone steroid that's for females, right? It gives you some of your female qualities. Also, men have it, but they have it in smaller concentration than females. Just like testosterone. Everybody has testosterone, but males typically have more because that gives you the more masculine things, like hair and broader shoulders in humans. And what's interesting, not that you need to know this, but remember this whole idea of structure and function. Obviously, these both give you a lot of your sexual characteristics, right? And that's a function. That's the same function. Obviously, though, some of them are feminine characteristics. Some of them are masculine. So therefore, they're slightly different. And the same thing with the structure. Let's look at the structure. This thing has an oxygen double bonded here. This one has an oxygen bonded to a hydrogen. This one has an oxygen double bonded here. This one has an oxygen bonded to a hydrogen. Other than that, they're exactly the same. So think about that. The only thing that's changing that makes you a man versus a female from this perspective is 2 hydrogens. That's it. So anyway, for the exam, know that the cholesterol is the key component. I didn't even say that, sorry. It's the key component of cell membranes, and also it is the base steroid. Don't memorize verbatim, base steroid, because if you just memorize those words but don't remember what it means, it doesn't matter. So the base steroid means it's like the blueprint. It's what we're starting with, the starting point. It's what we build everything else off of. We might not be able to finish this chapter today. So moving forward, is there any questions about that? The next slide I'm going to go through really quickly because it's not on the exam. This is what you're already probably most familiar with, because when I asked what you think about when you think of steroids, this is what you were talking about. Synthetic anabolic steroids. So when people talk about taking steroids illegally, this is what they're usually talking about. Of course, it's not always illegal. Again, I was prescribed them when I had poison ivy. It is a variant of testosterone. So remember that structure you saw earlier? It's probably a lot like that, but slightly different. And it probably depends on exactly which type it is. It will depend on how it's different. It mimics some of the effects of testosterone. This is why, like he said, when he had a skin condition, basically his body kind of needed to rebuild the skin cells. So that's part of what it's good for. Or when people have sort of issues where their muscles have atrophied, like wasted away, right? Testosterone can help, or excuse me, anabolic steroids can help with that. But because of that, they can also be used to build up muscles quickly, and they're often abused, right? People take them illegally. Obviously, that's not always a good thing. You guys know who that is on the bottom left, or am I just that old? Yeah, Mark McGuire. That was like common knowledge. That was a big thing. I was 18 when all that happened. Actually, I was in boot camp when that happened. So when I went into boot camp, he was like an amazing baseball player, revered. And then when I got out, it was like, yeah, he abused roids. Anyway, like I said, none of this is going to be on the exam, so I'm going through it quickly. Mostly these anabolic steroids, these synthetic steroids, they're mostly banned because they are hazardous. Why? They cause things like violent mood swings, which are roid rage. Like I said, my daughter gets a little bit angry when she has to do too many of her albuterol puffs. It could also cause depression, liver damage, high cholesterol, which makes sense, right? Because you have a variant of cholesterol. If you make some chemical changes to it, it's going to change into cholesterol. Shrunken testicles, reduced sex drive, infertility, yeah, so on and so forth. You don't need to know any of this for the exam. It's for your own knowledge. Any questions about that? It's interesting. I will say this before I move on. A lot of this, other than the high cholesterol, let's talk about like reduced sex drive and shrunken testicles, for example. That's like the opposite of what you would expect, right? Like this is the thing that's giving you masculine qualities. So why would you have shrunken testicles and reduced sex drive? It's because when you give your body something artificial, generally speaking, your body stops making it. So if you're giving your body some version of testosterone, your body's like, I don't need to make it. I've got it coming in. So therefore, you get the opposite effect. Same thing can be said with a lot of things like antidepressants and other medications. If your body's used to you giving it that chemical, it stops making it or it makes less of it. Anyway, good. Let's jump into proteins. 10 minutes. We can do this. So again, big picture, this whole chapter, we're talking about large biological molecules, carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. We're done talking about carbs and lipids. We're now moving on to a completely new category, which are proteins. So we're moving back into this idea of macromolecules, which are polymers made up of monomers. All right. Does anybody know what the monomer is? And I don't expect you to. Does anybody know what the monomer is for a protein? So what makes up a protein? And you probably know this word, you just might not know what it is, like how it's used biologically. That's all right. You will need to know it. Proteins are polymers of amino acids. I'm sure you've heard those words before. That's what an amino acid is. It's the building blocks for proteins. So the same way you can build a polysaccharide with a bunch of monosaccharides, like glucose, for example, the same way you can do that is the same way you build proteins with these things called amino acids. Proteins are very important. That's why your book tells you this. Not that that's a number you need to know. Well, first of all, one thing you do need to know, remember your cells are mostly water, right? Like 70, 95% water. If you were to take away all that water, then almost half of your cells made up of proteins. That in itself should tell you that they're very important because your cell is made up mostly of proteins when you adjust for the fact that there's water. So yeah, for the exam, all you need to know is that proteins are made up of amino acids. The rest of this slide is like, hey, this is why we're about to talk about proteins, because they're important. So nothing here is anything you need to know for the exam other than that first bullet point. It's just an introduction saying this is why this is important. This is why we're talking about it. So what do proteins do? Does anybody know? I know you do know some of them. Well, or I'll back it up a step and say something even easier. When you're not in biology class and someone says protein, what are you thinking of? If someone says, I need some protein, what do you think they mean? Yeah.
Protein powder.
Protein powder, right? So that would be like something you mix and make a drink with it. So you can ingest protein because you need protein in your diet. Good. Why might you need protein in your diet? What does your body use protein for? Energy, a little bit. Actually, yes. It's funny too. We'll talk about that on the next slide. And then after that, we pretty much don't talk about it ever again. But yes, your body does need it for energy. What else? How many of you have taken protein? You don't have to answer, but like, how many of you like taking protein shakes? Okay, and what for? Was it just because you like the flavor, or did you have like a goal? Put weight on, right? Specifically muscle weight, right? Because when you think of protein, a lot of times people think of muscles, and they should. Here's the different categories of protein. You do not need to know them, but this is again just kind of saying this is why it's so important. You've got structural proteins, like we said at the very beginning of the chapter when I showed you a picture of her. You can barely see her, but you can see her hair. You can see she's holding a steak. And I said, what are the two things they have in common? The steak and the hair? Proteins. The hair would be structural protein. It's the same kind of protein that's in your fingernails and the same kind of protein you would see in a lot of horns on animals. Storage proteins, you'll find a lot of those in cells and eggs, which makes sense because you have basically the baby of some sort of organism. And if you're going to grow a new organism, what do you need? You need energy and you need the things that build it. In that case, it's proteins. Contractile proteins. So when you think of proteins, other than protein shakes, and you're thinking about ingesting proteins, usually that's what you're thinking of is meat, right? Like, I need some protein. I'm going to have a steak. Of course, you can also get it from beans and things like that. But anyway, that's one of them. Another one, this one's really important, even though I'm not going to test you on it. We'll talk a lot about it in the next exam. Transport proteins. So a lot of things like your cells control what comes in and out of them. And that's a lot of how they do that. They have transport proteins that help do that. And then finally, we have enzymes. Also very, very important for the rest of the semester are enzymes. But we'll get into those in the next exam. So anyway, those are all the different categories of proteins. The last two on the right are the ones that we'll cover later in the semester. You don't need to know this for the exam. Like I already said, proteins are made up of monomers, or everything we're talking about other than lipids is made up of monomers. Specifically, the monomer of a protein is an amino acid. You need to know that. For everything, you need to know the polymer and the monomer. I haven't told you the polymer of a protein yet, but the monomer is the amino acid. You need to know that. You also need to know that every living thing that we know of on Earth is comprised of the same 20 amino acids. So even though you are a lot different than a banana, which is a lot different than a bacteria, which is much different than a whale, whatever you can think of, if you were to look at all of our proteins and what they're made from, it's all the same 20 building blocks. It'd be like if you went to a Lego museum and they had all these weird different structures, but they only had 20 Legos to work with, right? Same thing. So you need to know that. Again, amino acid is the monomer of a protein. There's 20 different versions of them. I put a little star on there because there's actually more than 20 amino acids, but there's only 20 amino acids that every living thing uses. Anyway, I said this at the beginning of the chapter 2. Sometimes not only do you need to know the monomer that makes up the polymer, sometimes you also need to know what the monomer is made up of. And in this case, you do. So we didn't say that about glucose, right? We say glucose is C6H12O6, but we didn't say you needed to know all the parts. And I didn't say you needed to memorize that glucose was C6H12O6. But here I am telling you, you do need to know what makes up an amino acid. You have that central carbon, excuse me. And remember, a carbon bonds 4 times, right? So what does it bond to in this situation? For every single amino acid, one of it bonds once to an amino group. It bonds to a hydrogen. It bonds to a carboxyl group. Every single amino acid is exactly the same in those 3 things. And then there's the 4th one, and that's where it's different. They also bond to a side chain. So remember all those functional groups we talked about earlier? This is where that comes back into play. So they have different side chains. So some amino acids are hydrophobic. Some of them are hydrophilic. Some of them are polar. Some of them are nonpolar. Some of them are positively charged. Some of them are negatively charged. Some of them are big. Some of them are small. All this structure function stuff obviously you should know that each amino acid is going to behave differently because of its structure. So any questions about this slide? Excuse me.
Do we need to know like the structure of amino group side chain?
Just know the 4 parts. I'm not necessarily I definitely won't give you this picture and say, all right, which one's the amino group? Which one's the carboxyl group? Which one's the side chain? I won't do that. Just know that an amino group is a carbon, and just like all other carbons, it has 4 bonds, and each one of those bonds is an amino group, a hydrogen, a carboxyl group, and a side chain. And know that it's the side chain is the only thing that varies. That's the thing that makes one amino acid different from another. So that's the thing that makes leucine different than tryptophan, for example. Any other questions about that? The next slide is going to be pretty easy because everything I've been talking about, except it's written in words. So the 3 groups that are common to all amino acids are the carboxyl group, the amino group, and the hydrogen atom. The variable portion, the part that identifies that amino acid as that amino acid, is the side chain. So again, I've already said all this. It's just now put into words for you. And even the next slide I'm going to show you is something I've already shown you too. That's another picture of another amino acid. It's the same thing, just drawn slightly different. So what I'm going to show you is a central carbon. And to the left of that, it's going to be bonded to an amino group. Up top, it's going to be bonded to a hydrogen. To the right, or the right as we're looking at it, it'll be bonded to a carboxyl group. And then, of course, to the bottom, it'll be bonded to a side chain. For some reason, whatever textbook you look at in my memory, they all look like this, right? They all have amino group on the left, carboxyl group on the right, side chain. But think about it. This is the thing in 3-dimensional space. So it all depends on where you look at it. It could be flipped. It doesn't matter. The point is you have the carbon bonded to those 4 things, and the one unique thing is the side chain. Yep, we already talked about that. Here's a good example. That's what leucine looks like versus serine. You can see that they're all identical other than the side chain. This one's hydrophobic, this one's this one's hydrophobic, this one's hydrophilic. So if they were meet together, they would push each other apart, right? And that'll be important next time we talk about this. You can see too, you remember when you were a kid and you had that game where you put blocks into different shaped holes? It's the same thing here. Even though you're thinking chemistry, this thing is going to fit in a different hole than this thing. And that is actually important for the grand scheme of this semester. So yeah, when we get back, we're going to talk about this and keep that in mind. So on Wednesday, we're going to meet online. We're going to finish this chapter up. And then we're going to go into the exam review. And then at 8:50, we will officially end the exam review. But I will stay on as long as you guys need. Well, we'll see. I'll stay on as long as I can to keep asking your questions about the exam. If you came in late, make sure you come in and you come to me and get your attendance.
So on Wednesday, we meet online.
Yep.
For lecture, then for lab meeting.
Yep.
Don't forget your parents.
Thank you. Get out of here. Oh, sorry.
I don't know why, but the thing took me out of Google Classroom. I don't know what happened. Sorry.
I'll help you in a second. Sorry. Alias, right? Yeah, you came in. So
Elias.
Elias. I don't know why I keep saying that. Yeah.
Oh no.
I'm the one with the weird name, and I'm the one messing up normal names. There's a skit with Key and Peele like that. Ron. All right. So got you. Hamrick. Got you. Got me. Yeah. Pena, Sigmund, Bayard, Hamlet, Lacey, Wazelle. Everybody's accounted for. Okay. I know more people came in late, but oh well. They're going to be counted absent now. I don't like that, but. How many points is an absence? 2.4. Technically, you can have 3 absences and still be okay, or still have a 100%. Also, if anybody's counted as absent, they can just go back on that day and watch the video and answer the questions.
You want to know something
I do.
really ironic?
What?
So I got started on these ADHD medications to help me focus.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they started giving me extreme mood swings, which cause stress. And after a certain amount of stress builds up in the human body, it's hard to retain information.
Yep. So it's counterintuitive or productive.
So it's like those medicines did the opposite of their intended purpose. Today I took them and I took notes in class and I could finally do it.
Oh.
I was like, oh.
Thank goodness.
God.
Well, did you change something or did it just click all of a sudden?